Shalom everyone, and thank you for joining me. New book, Deuteronomy, Sefer Dvarim, new Parashat, new journey to try to understand some of the most significant lessons that the Torah has to share with us in this book. The Torah begins with El HaDvarim. These are the things, so these are the sayings that Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Israel, that Moshe spoke to all of Am Israel. Be'ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan River, because Moshe was not able to enter the land of Israel. במדבר, in the desert, בערבה, מול סוף בין פערן ובין תופל, ולבן וחצרות ודיזהב. Basically, this is a list of all different types of places, that the Jewish people journeyed through. Some of them we can identify, they sound familiar, and some of them we can barely identify. And our sages try to give a different interpretation to every name of every place that we cannot identify on a map. But I would like to ask a different question. Why do we need it? Why do we need a list of all those places that the Jewish people went through? Why do I need here a list of history of our journey? I can look at Sefer Bamidbar, I can look at the book of Numbers that we just completed last week, and to know exactly, and also in the book of Exodus, to make a map of all the places, I can do it by myself. Why do I need to repeat the history of our journey? So I would like to speak to you today about the role of history in Jewish life. What exactly is the difference between history and remembrance? As we say in Hebrew, historia, history, and remembrance, which is zikaron. It will be interesting to try to define each one of them, to try to understand the importance of each of these two expressions or sayings, history and versus remembrance, and to try to see what the Jewish religion and what is our Jewish thought has to say about it. So Professor Carr, in his idea of what is history, says the following: history is the long struggle of man, by exercise of his reason, to understand his environment and to act upon it. But the modern period has broadened the struggle in a revolutionary way. Man now seeks to understand and act on not only his environment, but himself. And this has added, so to speak, a new dimension to reason and a new dimension to history. It seems to be that he is trying to convey to us a very interesting message. History can obviously help us to understand the reality that we live in. Is to try to understand, when people would look at history, they would like to understand the sequence of events, to try to see how they got to where they got, where did it begin, and to their days and to their reality. However, in modern times, we look into history not only to understand the environment that we live in, the reality that we face, but also to try to understand ourselves. History, in a way, is a component of our own being, of our own DNA. If you know your history, we know in the medical field now, medical history of your family, medical history is very important, it's crucial. When I know what was the DNA of your parents, your grandparents, what kind of diseases, God forbid, they had to struggle through, so I can know more about you. Same thing with history of nations, history of conflicts. When you understand the history, it can give you a better perspective on life and reality, but also a better perspective about yourself, to see what's your role now, how are you a link in that chain from that began with the beginning of history until today. So obviously there is a significant, and there is so much of an importance to understand and to learn, to study history. Rav Soloveitchik totally changed his mind regarding the Zionistic movement and the Mizrahi movement in particular. And he cut ties in a way with his family tradition, who did not support the Zionistic movement, and he became the head of the Mizrahi movement. And he says, the years of Hitlerian Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the accomplishments of the Mizrahi in the land of Israel convinced me of the correctness of our movement's path. Rav Soloveitchik took a courageous step, basically deviated away from his family tradition of supporting Aguda, which is more of the Haredi movement, and he became the president of the Mizrahi and the leader of the modern Orthodox movement, the Zionistic movement, I would call it, in America. The idea is that Rav Soloveitchik looked at history and very current history of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. He looked at that history, he looked at those events, and he did what we call histosophia, which means he gave content, meaning, to events that he went through or that he witnessed. He learned from history not only what was before, but what is expected of him to do now. And we need to know Rav Soloveitchik paid a tremendous personal price for doing so. So the idea of history is not only to understand where you came from, to understand things about yourself. Rav Soloveitchik adds another dimension to history. You look at history, and it basically should encourage you, motivate you to rethink your life, to rethink about the decisions that you made in your life, and to probably reevaluate your life, and demands of you to really think, do you need to make a change? So again, history is not only to understand what happened before, it's not only even to understand, reasons to understand what you are facing now, but also how am I going to shape my future based on the history. Rav Kook, in Arpilei Toar, says the following, Ikar hashmiya b'kol Hashem, the main understanding or the main idea of listening to the voice of God, הוא מה שמקשיבים את כל התהלוכה של דרכי החיים לכל פרטיהם. It's when you listen to all the events that are going on in our lives. Everything. What is going on in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, what's going on in the other countries, what's going on in the world, everything. God is involved with everything. האדם השומע ומאזין יותר בבירור את כל השם הדובר אליו, מורהו מצווהו ממש. Rav Kook, in a way, is taking even a further step than Rav Soloveitchik. He basically says Hashem speaks through history. If you would listen, if you will look at historical events, not just as coincidence, or not just as, it just happened to be and I happened to be there, right time, I was lucky. It's not that. Rav Kook is saying, look at the events that you are going through and try to listen what God is trying to tell you. Now, obviously, there is a lot of uncertainty. No one knows exactly what Hashem wants from you. But you need to open up your ears and to open up your eyes and to try to listen and to see what are the messages. Why is it that this event took place right now? Not that you know the reasons, but the lessons that you can derive from it is precious. Tzvi Yanai is the author of a magazine that was very popular in Israel in the 80s. And in one of the articles in that magazine, it's called Machshavot, Thoughts, he talked a lot about history. And I think it's really important to read this article in order to enrich our understanding of history and then later on, remembrance. When you look at history, when you think about history, we need to ask ourselves a very fundamental question. What makes an event a historical event? Now, let's have that question aside for a second. And now let's read. גישה ספקנית זו למעמדן האבסולוטי כביכול של העובדות ההיסטוריות הביאה מן הסתם את קולינגווד לומר שכל עובדה בעבר היא חסרת משמעות עד אשר מבין ההיסטוריון את המשמעות התמונה מאחריה. So, the question is a historical event is an absolute event, or it was really an interpretation of the historian who wrote it? Which means we have many books, history books. What is the reason that one story made it to this history book while we for sure know that there were many other stories, such as this story or different stories, that never made it? The answer is they were never documented. Or maybe the historian of that time did not think that they are important enough to be documented. So when we read about, let's say, Greek history, Roman history, American history, British history, whatever you want. So you need to ask yourself a question. Whatever I read now in this history book, is that absolute? This is the only thing that took place? Or this is the only thing of significance that took place? Or there are others and just the historian who wrote it didn't think it's important enough to bring it in? Which means this history is an interpretation to an event that specific historian wrote, or this is really what exactly took place. So therefore, he wants to claim that when you read history, you need to know not only the history, you need to know about the historian who wrote it. You need to know where he or she lived, what kind of the environment they lived in, and what motivated him or her to testify, to witness, to write, to document that specific historical event. אמירה זו, this statement, שהיא מתונה לכל הדעות בהשוואה להצהרתו של קארל בייקר, עובדות ההיסטוריה אינן קיימות לגבי היסטוריון, עד אשר הם מייצרים אותם, עשויה להביא את האדם הרגיל במבוכה. שהרי מורגל הוא לזהות היסטוריה, עם מדע שיש מאחוריו קונצנזוס ברור, להבדיל מסיפורי מעשיות. What I told you now, I hope I confused you. Because until now, if I will tell you, look, that's what it says in that history book. You will look at the history book, you will look at that story, and you would say, okay, for sure, it took place. It took place exactly the way it was written in this book. But now, I'm telling you, says Tzvi Yanai, based on different interpretations of different historians, it's not sure that that's exactly what happened. It happened according to that historian. Now, if that's true, who says he was right? Who says that his judgment was not clouded with something else? Who told us that he was not paid to write what he wrote in order to portray, let's say, the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire or this Roman Caesar in a different light? So now, if we thought that history is somewhat of almost like an accurate science, now it's really very not of a specific science or anything to do with science. It's basically interpretation of the historian who wrote those things. אך במחשבה שנייה. But when you think about it again, יש בטענה זו כדי להפוך את ספר ההיסטוריה מאוסף של עובדות מתות, כמו רשימות המלאי של אחת מממלכות העבר, להוויה חיה המגלה לכל תקופה פנים חדשות, ולפיכך מאפשרת להווה להיות שותף פעיל ביצירתו הדינמית של העבר. This is so insightful. He suggests that really we need to think about what we said before, not as a downer, that now we are all confused, we don't want to believe history, we don't want to learn history, exactly the opposite. When you know that when you read a history book, you need to, in a way, judge it, not only from the facts, but also for who was the historian who wrote it. You know, one of the best examples is Josephus Flavius, who wrote a lot about the Roman Empire. Josephus Flavius was a Jew who basically extradited himself to the Romans, and then he became their historian. And he wrote a lot about the rebellious and about the Jews, but we know he was paid by the Romans. So when you know that, you try to not only to read history, but you try to study history, to analyze history. And you ask yourself, why Josephus Flavius wrote this thing? And then you compare it to other sources and you enrich your understanding of history. History is not science. History is a story that was written by someone who thought that that's important enough to be documented for years to come, but now it's upon us to take this information, to take those facts, and instead of them just being dates, nations, names, countries, it will become a living being. It's something that we, in a way, inject life to it because we judge it from our perspective and then try to understand or to derive lessons from it to something that is relevant to us. Mikana maskana, and from here you have the outcome or the consequences or the results, אותם מביע פרופסור סולטמן, that Professor Saltman suggested, כי מי שרוצה ללמוד היסטוריה, that if you want to study history, צריך לדעת מה היה סולם העדיפויות של ההיסטוריונים שכתבו אותה. You need to know a lot about the historian himself or herself that wrote that piece of history. And when you know it, when you read it, you can understand perhaps even hidden lessons and hidden messages that historian wanted us years later to try to understand. Anyone here who studied Talmud, sometimes in the Talmud we have pieces of history. Some of them are accurate, some of them are not that accurate when you compare them to history books. However, when you understand that our sages were not historians, they use history and things that took place in the past, but they try to convey spiritual messages. So then you understand that the history was just a tool in order to convey a different lesson. קאר מוסיף, and Professor Carr adds to it, הסתכל גם על תאריך הוצאתו של הספר. Don't only know the facts, don't only study who is the historian, but also look at the date that history book was published. Because if it was published in the 18th century, and it's something about Jewish life, so you need to know about the Enlightenment movement. If it was in the 2nd century, so you need to know. If it was something about the land of Israel, so you need to know about the Roman Empire, you need to know about early Christianity, you need to learn about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash that was at 70 or 133 to 135, the rebellions of Bar Kokhba. You need to understand that history or things that happen in the past, it's not only the story itself, it's also the entire, I will call it, surrounding of that case. ואם כן ההיסטוריה, אף על פי שבעיקרה הייתה צריכה להיות אובייקטיבית ועובדתית, so even though history should have been basically very objective and very fact-based, היא נהפכת להיות סובייקטיבית. It basically transformed into subjective history ומעוצבת and shaped על ידי פרשנותם של ההיסטוריונים. And it's being shaped by the interpretations of the historians. And here he brings a very, very interesting example. ססקר כתב שב-1850 התנפל אספסוף בריטי על סוחר והרגו. One of the stories that in the British Empire in 1850, a mob of English people basically attacked a merchant and he murdered him. האם זו עובדה היסטורית? Is that a historical fact? עד לפני שנים אחדות היה משיב בלאו. Until a few years ago he would say, sure not. That's not a historical event. אך לא מזמן צוטט מקרה זה על ידי דוקטור קיטסון קלארק. במסגרת סדרת הרצאות שנשא באקספורד, והחל מאותו רגע, הפך מקרה זה מועמד לחברות במועדון העובדות ההיסטוריות, ממתין לספנסר שני. So, this little story of a British mob murdering a merchant was written and then was quoted years later by Dr. Kitson Clark in a series of lectures he gave in Oxford, and then it became a historical event, waiting for a second sponsor. אפשר אומר כך שמקרה זה יופיע במרוצת השנים בהערות שוליים, ואחר כך בטקסט גופו, של מאמרים על אנגליה של המאה ה-19, ובתוך 30 שנה יהפוך לעובדה היסטורית מבוססת. He basically says the process is, something is written, a professor, a rabbi, a lecturer, whatever it is, mentions it in his series of classes. Someone else listens to it, puts it in a footnotes in his thesis, and then it becomes a historical event of a 19th century England. קאר סבור כי סיכוייו של מקרה זה להיכנס לספרי ההיסטוריה אינם תלויים בחשיבותו האובייקטיבית, אלא בשאלה אם התזה שהציג דוקטור קיטסון במסגרתה צוטת המקרה, תאומץ על ידי ההיסטוריונים כמשמעותית ומהימנה. הסטטוס של מקרה זה כעובדה היסטורית הוא אפוא עניין של אינטרפטציה. Which means, it says, the chances for a minute case to become a historical event depends on what? Depends on who is going to quote it, when is it going to be quoted, and if that quote will be adopted by the historians as a fact. And when they think it's a fact, it's based on their interpretation, it will become a historical event. כל היסטוריה היא היסטוריה בת זמננו. עיקר תפקידו של ההיסטוריון הוא לא לרשום, אלא להעריך. שכן אם נמנע מלהעריך, כיצד ידע מה לרשום? It says really when the historian was thinking about what to write down as a historical event and what not, he had to evaluate in his mind or in her mind what is really the lessons, the messages, the importance, the significance of the event that I am going to testify, that I am going to write about. Without that process of thinking, he would not write it. קאר אומר כי העובדות הן בבחינת דגים השתים באוקיינוס רחב ידיים. קאר suggested that the facts, the historical facts, are like fish that basically swim in the big ocean. מה שההיסטוריון מעלה בחכתו תלוי בחלקו במקרה, אך בעיקר באיזה אזור של האוקיינוס בחר לדוג ובאיזה וו השתמש לחכתו. So you have the facts, the historical facts, they are like fish that swim in the ocean. The historian sits there with his rod and he tried to what? To fish. And then whatever he catch and whatever side of this ocean he is, that's what he's going to find. Which means history is not just dry facts. History is the process of evaluation of an event by the historian back then and our interpretation right now. צבי ינאי concludes, גישה זו שבעיקרון טוענת שההיסטוריון הוא זה שקובע איזה אירוע יהפוך לאירוע היסטורי, פוגע במידה רבה במעמד הסמכותי ממנו נהנו העובדות תקופה ארוכה, ועם זאת יכול מי שמבקש זאת, לנפות את האינטרפטציות מן העובדות על ידי קריאה של כל הגרסאות. צבי ינאי suggests, he says, I understand, in a way I burst your bubble. If we thought before this shiur, this class, that history is almost like science and you cannot question it, and if it says in a history book that that's what happened, that's exactly what happened, now we are saying no, not at all. Question it. Try to understand who wrote it, when, why. All those big questions that basically help us to analyze history. So yes, it does hurt the absolute power and authority that history used to have. But it does not mean that it never happened. It happened based on the interpretation, based on the facts, and then the interpretation of the historian. So yes, it's not that authoritative, but it puts the responsibility on us to try to understand why he or she wrote it, why he or she thought that this is so important for generations to come to know that this event took place, and what do we do with it? So why is that so important to us? The Torah says at the end of Deuteronomy, Zchor yemot olam, remember the days of past. Binu shno dor vador. Binu is from the word leitbonen, to look into it with wisdom, with understanding, in every generation. Sh'al avicha veyagetcha, ask your ancestors and they will tell you, zkenecha, the elders, veyomru lach. In a way, we have a commandment to look at history. We have a commandment to study history. We have a commandment to ask the elders about what they went through, about events that took place. And we all understand that everything that I just shared with you on behalf of Tzvi Yanai in his magazine, Machshavot, Thoughts, it's in a way condensed into this verse. You cannot really truly appreciate who you are, the time that you live in, your reality, and I will even dare to say your future, without knowing your history, without this connection to the previous generation. without delving into the past, not in order to dwell in the past, not in order to say, oh, the days of the past were so good, everyone was so righteous, everyone was so pious, and now, unfortunately, today it's terrible. No, this is not the goal. This is not the purpose of studying history. The purpose of studying history is to know what you face and how do you plan and shape your future. בינו שנות דור ודור, says Rashi, דור אנוש שהציף עליהם מי האוקיינוס ודור המבול ששטפם. So the first interpretation that Rashi says, what does it mean, binu? Like to look into, to study, shnot dor vador, the years of every generation. He says you need to look at what kind of generations? The generation of the flood and the generation that start worshipping idols. Why Rashi chose these two generations? I think it's pretty obvious. This is the first two generations in the book of Genesis that totally deviated from God's plan. The first one, start worshipping idols, abandoning God, and the second one were corrupt. They stole, they raped, they murdered. So they totally deviated in terms of morality. The first generation deviated in terms of monotheism. Religion is not only believing in God, it's also being moral and ethical. So you need to look at what they did so you don't do it again. And if you sense that someone in your generation, in your nation, is doing so, you need to stop them. דבר אחר, לא נתתם לבבכם על שעבר. Moshe is rebuking the Jewish people and telling them, בינו שנות דור ודור. You need to look at what the other generation did so you don't repeat it. You know, there is a famous sentence that says, history repeats itself. It's true when you don't study history. History repeats itself because we allow it to repeat itself. History is there not to be repeated. History is there in order to study and to learn from it, so you don't repeat the same mistakes that other people do. It gives you, in a way, the key for much better life. שאל אביך, says Rashi, ask your father, אלו הנביאים שנקרא אבות. You need to ask the prophets. זקניך אלו החכמים. Your elders, those are the sages. ויאמרו לך הראשונות. Meaning you ask the sage to tell you about what's happened before. Because he's not going to give you only the facts. History is not only about dates and names and places. It's much more than that. It's about the content, the meaning, the lessons that you can learn from years past. Ramban, Nachmanides, 13th century in Spain, says, Perush zchor yemot olam. What is the interpretation of remember the days of old? Shitnu lev lizkor sheshet yemei bereshit. Ramban says that Moshe says to the Jewish people, you should remember the 6 days of creation. הטובה שעשה להם בעת היצירה, כמו שיאמר בהנחל עליון גויים. You need to remember God's kindness to you when He created this world for you and He gave you the land of Israel. בינו שנות דור ודור. Understand the years of every generation. שיבינו לדעת, that they should understand with tremendous insight מה שנעשה להם בדורות מעת ששרתה שכינה ביניהם כאשר יספר. They need to know all the events that took place since שרתה עליהם שכינה, since the divine presence dwelled among them, which was Har Sinai. From the moment we received the Torah and we became a chosen nation until today, Ramban 13th century, us 21st century, we need to go and through what exactly happened to us. What does Hashem want from us? We will not have clear 100% answers that are for sure, but at least we will have some kind of a path, sometimes of something of significance to think about and to try to shape our future. The Malbim says, שעל אביך ויגדך מצד הקבלה והסיפור, זקניך שראו כל זה בעיניהם ויאמרו לך. The Malbim has a little bit of a different insight. He says, ask your parents and they will tell you the story. A story has its own tools to convey a message. There are facts, and then there is a story. A story is something that we always do. We tell the story. We tell the story in a very unique night that we will speak about it in a minute. A night of Leil HaSeder. The mitzvah of Leil HaSeder, besides the matzah and the maror and korban pesach and everything, is telling of the story. Because the story brings history to life. Zkenecha, your elders, shera'u kol ze beinehem. You have Kabbalah, you have tradition that comes through listening, and then you have people who saw it. They were there, and they are telling you. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. You shall remember the Shabbat day in order to sanctify. It says Rashi, תנו לב לזכור תמיד את יום השבת. שאם נזדמן לך חפץ יפה, תהא מזמינו לשבת. Here we have an additional interpretation, and this is where the Jewish thought comes in. We don't have only history. We also have zikaron, remembrance. Remembrance, and to remember something is not just to go visit the museum and go home. To remember something is to revive it, is to rejuvenate it, it's to renew it, it's to make it alive, it's to make it new, it's to make it something that I, you, and her, and him can relate to. When it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, you should remember the Shabbat day, what does it mean? שאם נזדמן לך חפץ יפה, that during the week, today is Tuesday, tomorrow is Wednesday, when you see something, you say, okay, this is for Shabbat. Every day that you go, you remember the Shabbat. Shabbat is alive. Shabbat is not only the seventh day, you visit it, and then on Sunday, you do something else. Shabbat is something that escorts you on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. This is the meaning of Schira in Yahadut, in Judaism. It's not only just to remember something that happened in the past and to learn some lessons from it. It's very important. But we have an additional component, which is to take a historical event and to relive it, to rejuvenate it. Says the Sforno, 16th century in Italy, היה תמיד זוכר את יום השבת בעסקיך בימי המעשה, כמו זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק. Another commandment to remember what Amalek did to us. It's not just that, one day of the year we go and we remember and we read the Parashat that talks about Amalek. You need to remember it every day of your life. You need to remember that there was a nation that attacked you with no reason. There was a nation that wanted to annihilate you with nothing to do with you. But there was a full, pure hate. The idea is that, as we saw, the role of history has a tremendous component of Judaism. But Judaism adds yet another dimension: remembrance, zikaron. Not only history, not only to understand how you get where you got. It's not only to understand yourself. It's not only even to make major decisions. It's not only to hear the hand of God and to see the hand of God in history. It's to revive it, to make it relevant, to rejuvenate it, to tell the story to our children, to make sure that they remember and they live their lives like that. So when you have history and you have zikaron, you have future, you have atid. Thank you.